let me briefly outline what we're going to do in this session. We've got Dr. Emma Hilton, who's a trustee of Sex Matters. She's going to speak after me and tackle some of the scientific questions. She'll make a few remarks, and then when we come to Q&A, you can ask her everything you ever wanted to know about disorders of sex development in sport. And we are being joined by two Olympians, Sharron Davies and Yamauchi. They are the women who know what it's like to be out there and to be competing, and they both have experience of knowing that there were people competing against them where there was an unfair advantage. And whilst that's not what we're here to talk about necessarily, I think you'll hear what it's really like for the competitors. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes briefly, then Emma for a few minutes, then Sharron and Mara, and then we'll put it over to Q&A for the majority of the time. We're planning to spend about an hour. You can put your questions in the chat anonymously. Why we want to do this is to dispel the misinformation that is out there. And there are three myths in particular that we keep hearing. One of them is that sex is on a spectrum and that there are people in between, and they sometimes called intersex, and that these unfortunate people need to be accommodated. First of all, that these people exist, and then that they need to be accommodated. Secondly, we hear that there are individuals who were born as a girl, born female, raised female, and then grew up to be women with high testosterone. Now, that's what is always said about the South African 800-meter runner, Caster Semenya. That is false. That is false. When they say women with high testosterone in the world of sport, they actually mean men with normal testosterone. And what tends to have happened is that these were born as babies with genitals that didn't look quite right, didn't look like a little boy. And so they were either accidentally or intentionally registered as girl, whether it was known or not that there was something amiss. Doesn't tend to happen where there is good access to healthcare, tends to happen more in rural areas. So Emma's going to talk a bit more about that. Let's talk about what we know about these two boxers, Khalif and Lynn, because that's why we're here. We know from the IBA declarations, which have been done in properly accredited labs, that they have XY chromosomes. We know that other boxers and their teams around them have been raising concerns for some time. We know, and I can tell you one of these stories a bit later, that people who have seen them up close in the training environment also have concerns about their disproportionate power. And therefore, there's enough reason for people to legitimately ask, are these boxers eligible for the female category? The female category being the one where male advantage is not allowed because it's unfair, and in boxing it's unsafe. So that's one thing we know about them. The other thing we know is they may have been registered as female at birth. What does that tell us? Well, we know everyone's either male or female, and that's determined in babies by looking at their genitals, but that's just a ready reckoner. It's usually right, but sometimes it can be wrong. If something goes wrong in the developmental pathway for a baby, then the ambiguous genitals can be misleading. And we know now, because of the Court of Arbitration for Sport, that that was the case for those 800-meter runners, and we'll talk more about that. So that's called a DSD, difference of sex development or disorder of sex development. When the development goes wrong, the baby is born, something looks not quite right, sometimes they develop later. But it's really important to understand they're all either male or female. And if an error was made when they were registered, then, or culturally, it was decided that it's better to be a girl than a boy if their genitals don't look right, that doesn't change reality. So those are, we think, the big issues that are out there that are confusing people when people say they were female, they were born female, they grew up as female. They may indeed have been registered as female. That doesn't mean that they do not bring male advantage to the female category. One other thing briefly before I hand over to Emma. The focus here should be on the IOC because they are running the boxing. These are their rules in action. And what this illustrates is when you put a belief system ahead of material reality, this is where you end up. So they have declared that transgender identity and differences of sex development are no reason to question anyone, that if someone declares they are female, then as far as they're concerned, that's all the IOC wants to hear. They've talked about passport as the entry qualification for the boxing. And we see this not just in the IOC, but in other areas of life. We see it in healthcare and education, where the decision to believe that someone's sex doesn't matter, that it's their feeling about their gender that matters, means that you then have to ignore the evidence. You have to not do a sex test, because that's going to give you information you don't know how to deal with. And that's what we've seen happening here. So the boxing is just, in a sense, a very striking, if you'll pardon the pun, example of what happens when belief in gender ideology takes over an organization. And thankfully, that's not happened in all the other sports federations. It's happened in some and not others. So with that, then, let me hand over to Dr. Emma Hilton to tell us a little bit more about the relevant DSDs in sport.
Thanks, Fiona. So yeah, I'm going to try and make some scientific sense of what's being said and what I'm seeing being reported, and how lack of kind of scientific understanding of what we're talking about here with DSDs is creating an awful lot of confusion. But I will start with, again, just reiterating what Fiona said, which is that there are only two sexes, okay, male or female. And this is just really basic evolutionary fact. But this fact obviously has consequences for sport, because men are, as a group, taller, faster, and they are much stronger than women. And none of this is kind of remotely controversial in any kind of scientific domain. And it's why we have male and female categories in sport. And also, you know, from a kind of scientific point of view, we know what it is about males that makes them taller, faster, and much stronger than females. And it's part of their sex development. It's not the entirety of their sex development, but it's part of their sex development. And it's kind of a chain, a sequence of events that happens as they're developing in the womb. And so it starts with the start of this chain, the start of this, you know, sequence of events that makes males taller, faster, and much stronger. It starts with growing testes, okay? So males grow testes, females grow ovaries. And these testes are going to start making lots of hormones, most notably testosterone, huge amounts of testosterone production from the testes. And this testosterone has an effect not just on male reproductive development, you know, making all the kind of internal tubes and growing a penis and that kind of thing, but also on the whole body system, on muscle cells, on bone cells, and those kinds of things. And it's that whole body system that's relevant for sport. So that's the kind of developmental chain that we're thinking about here. You've got some testes, they're going to make testosterone, and that has an effect on your body. But we do know, as Fiona said, that some babies, rarely, we're really talking about, you know, a rare kind of genetic disorder or medical condition here, but some babies have medical conditions. That means something goes wrong with their reproductive development as they're growing in the womb. And so, as Fiona said, what that means is that when a baby's born, and, you know, a midwife, doctor, whoever looks at their external genitals and says it's a girl, this isn't always an accurate kind of reflection of that baby's sex. These are DSDs, disorders of sex development, and, you know, we're talking about this because of the Olympic boxing. So what we do know is that we've got two athletes who were apparently observed by looking at their external genitals as girls, or at least who had F, female, marked on their birth certificate, but whose sex chromosomes are male, okay? They've got a Y chromosome. I've looked at the sex testing procedures that have been used to make that call for the IBA. They are perfectly good tests. They're run by perfectly good labs. It's precisely the kind of technology that I would use in a, sex testing environment. So these boxes have a Y chromosome, and in healthy babies, in healthy males who don't have a disorder of sex development, they'd grow into healthy boys. But the question here that we want to think about is maybe, what does this mean for sport? So there are several different male DSDs that might lead to a baby being born with external genitals that look female. But when we think about sport, we can think about two sets of male DSDs. So we've got one set where those individuals have male development, male puberty, male hormones, all that male physiology that makes men taller, faster, and stronger than women. And those who don't have any male characteristics that are relevant for sport, at least. We don't know which set these boxes fall into. Their testosterone levels would help us understand. And both the IBA and the IOC have stated that they both have high testosterone, which in combination with what we know are XY chromosomes, that tells us they have testes. But the IBA have also said they didn't do testosterone testing. I think what they meant there was testosterone testing wasn't done as part of the sex testing protocol. And that doesn't mean they don't have testosterone information from things like anti-doping screens. And to be honest, these are the questions that journalists should have been asking. How would I go about this to find the precise male DSD so we can really understand about sports categorization? That would need a deeper analysis of their genes, not just their chromosomes. But this is still really straightforward to do with just, a cheek swab, a blood sample, and it would probably take maybe a week, in a kind of professional lab dedicated to it. And I'm talking here probably about a medical lab, not a sports fed lab. They could almost certainly do this much more quickly than I can. What would we be looking for? Mutations in genes that growing male babies need, to become a healthy male. So genes that are involved for processing testosterone, that are needed to grow male external genitalia and so on. So we're kind of essentially trying to work out where in development healthy male development broke down. That doesn't mean we don't have any reasonable predictions about which of these two sets of male DSDs they fall into. And the reason we can, make some predictions about this is because sports selects for physical advantages. And so given the enormous athletic advantage of having male physiology in female sports, it's not surprising to any of us here that male DSDs that are vastly overrepresented in female sports are the ones where all that male physiology is present. And this has been, I think, most vividly pictured in Rio 2016, when that female 800-meter podium was composed entirely of athletes like Caster Semenya, who have all of that male biology that gives male advantage in sport. I've seen some, like I say, some crazy attempts to describe DSDs this week, including the Daily Mail, for example, saying that Semenya's genetic abnormality was growing internal testes. And it makes me laugh because it's something I do make a joke about in my lectures. But the Y chromosome is not a genetic abnormality, right? In the male DSD that Semenya has, it's called 5ARD, and we can maybe have questions about that afterwards. The genetic mutation is in a gene that's needed to grow male external genitalia. And until development reaches that point, all the normal male stuff that comes before it is happening perfectly normally. So some people are getting the developmental biology entirely backwards. And really, I've always been available to kind of take questions on this. But just briefly then going back to the boxes, it is possible that unlike, say, Caster Semenya, the male DSDs they have don't include male physiology. It's possible, yes. But given what we know about sports, is it the most likely situation? No. But the IOC are kind of hiding behind legal sex, what's on their passports. And they're actually just ignoring the very real possibility that they're allowing males into the female boxing ring. And just as an example of how dangerous that is, the way Khalif, for example, is fighting at, the potential strength differences, and I've analysed like tons of data from weightlifting and strength sports to get a handle on this. At the weight Khalif is fighting, allowing a male into the female boxing ring is kind of the equivalent of letting a heavyweight into the ring with a lightweight. Okay, a female has to be well over 30 kilograms heavier than a male to match strength levels. Okay, so this is a yawning chasm. I think people really underestimate the difference between male and female strength. But some of this is a bit kind of by the by, because the IOC don't actually want sex testing to happen at all. I think it's necessary. I'll be making that case in the scientific literature this week. I think it's necessary to protect the female category, which, you know, everyone, including the IOC, seems to agree is needed. And it's actually clear from my conversations with sports federations that this is now being considered as a routine part of a kind of, you know, athletes' sports passport. But like Fiona says, whatever the IOC wants about sex testing, that doesn't mean we can somehow pretend it hasn't happened. And right now it's throwing up some really serious questions about how the IOC is ignoring a really quite a serious safety risk for female athletes in what I would say is, quite frankly, a very dangerous sport. So I'm happy to stop there and just take questions afterwards, see how the conversation goes.
Great, thanks, Emma. So we've got some questions that were pre-submitted and we've got some coming up in the chat. But before we come to those, we're going to go to Sharron for her thoughts and then Mara for hers. Over to you, Sharron.
Good afternoon, everybody. I know that everybody knows I've been talking about this since the IOC changed the rules in 2015. And to anyone that understood sport, they knew that this is where we were going to end up. Unless we bring back sex screening, we're going to end up putting women in a position where it's just accepted that they have a disadvantage. And this is discrimination. It's discrimination on the basis of sex. Biological sex is binary. There's male and female. DSDs are either male or female. You know, it's a very simple thing to bring back sex screening. And in fact, the athletes are very keen. When I speak to the athletes, they feel frustrated, marginalized, ignored, undervalued, discriminated against, silenced, which is also really, really important in all of this. They're having their voices taken away and subjugated. You know, they feel as if their fairness, their safety is second to male individuals' feelings. And the feelings of female athletes are just irrelevant. And I just cannot, for the life of me, understand how we're in this position. And all the science shows us that we can't remove male puberty advantage. We can't remove male biological advantage. There are things like Q angles exist. You know, in boxing, it is insane to put a male in a ring with a female and for the IOC to say the only thing that's important to them is what a passport says. This to me is genuine neglect. Their duty of care has been thrown out the window, and my head wants to explode when I see this. You know, I just don't understand how we're in this position. And then my head wants to explode again when the journalists don't do their jobs properly and find out what DSDs are and speak in proper language so that the general public can understand. Because we're going around in circles where we are fooling the general public, and you're doing the dirty work for the IOC instead of exposing what the IOC are doing, which is, and you should be standing up for female athletes, for truth, for science, for common sense. You're doing their dirty work for them. You're confusing the general public. There is no confusion in this. It's very straightforward. Biological females should be protected to have their own classification of sport. That's 51% of this world's population are entitled to what males get. And at the moment, they're being told they just don't matter. And it's heartbreaking. It really is. And everyone knows my opinion on this. I wrote a book about it. It took me a year to research it, and 9 years so far talking about it. And here we are. We're literally on the cusp of a female athlete potentially being killed if we're not careful. I mean, it really is that bad. So that's really all I have to say about this, because I'm just astonished that we're here.
And before we come to Mara, let me add one thing. I've been talking to boxers, both male and female. And one of them, a woman who was a national champion in her own country, said to me, just like Sharron said, when the IOC changed the rules in 2015-16, and bear in mind, that was testosterone suppression. That wasn't just passport sex. So that was not as lax as where they are now. But when that rule was changed, she said the boxers, the women, looked at each other and said, this is going to be bad. And here we are.
And the only other thing I'd like to add, Fiona, is that people have to look back at the history of the IOC and their horrendous history of looking after female athletes. You know, everyone knows the reason I speak out is for 20 years, they allowed the East German state to dope young women, 13, 11, 12, 13 years old, full of testosterone. Every single person in the track, in the swimming pool, at the rowing venue, knew exactly what was going on. The IOC did nothing for 20 years. They allowed female athletes to be cheated out of their medals, and they had allowed these young East German girls to be poisoned to the state that all of them have health issues and many of them have died. The history of the IOC defending female athletes is atrocious.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharron. Over to you, Mara.
Thanks very much, Fiona. So my event was the marathon and distance running, not boxing, but I just want to give you a few quick points based on my career as an elite athlete. And to be frank, I've been horrified seeing what's been going on in the boxing in Paris. So in running, the male-female performance gap is approximately 10% at elite level. In boxing, punching power, the gap is 162%. So the gap in running is relatively small compared to boxing. Of course, boxing is not only about punching power. It's a very athletic event involving, you know, moving around the ring, strength, power, and so on. But in punching power alone, 2.5 times is the male to female performance gap. After this webinar, we will share with you 2 quick clips in athletics which illustrate the massive gap between males and females. One is the British Olympic marathon trials for the Tokyo Olympics, which were held in March 2021. The males and females, so this is approximately 30 of the top British male and female marathon runners. They had a joint start, and after 26 seconds of a 2-hour+ event, all males were ahead of all females. So that gives you an illustration.
So away they go then. The racing is off at exactly 8 a.m. local time. The walks earlier, the 20k walk has set off at 6 a.m. not long after the after sun was up. But I don't think the temperature is going to rise much for these athletes, even though it's slightly later in the morning. And if anything, the wind has picked up over the last hour or so.
There's also an excellent clip from the mixed 4x4 relay in Doha 2019, which also illustrates the massive gap.
That, the inaugural champions to be crowned. Sveti Ercetic, and it's Michael Cherry storming round that bend trying to close the gap. Javon Francis is in 3rd place for the Jamaicans. And look at the speed with which Cherry takes the Polish woman. She's grimacing and she's being reeled in here. Martin Rooney trying to close in on the Bahrainian. Sveti Ercetic is going to get caught here, but can she hang on for a medal? The gold is going to go to Michael Cherry and the United States, the inaugural champions. It will also mean Alison Felix moves to 12 world titles.
I want to give you a couple of facts which give you a feel for how this male-female performance gap manifests itself in reality. In 2009, I ran my personal best 2:23.12. In that year, I was ranked 2nd in the world in women's road running. But in that year alone, 1,300 men ran faster than me, and this is because of their sex. So you can see that the gap between the best male and the best female is so enormous that a huge number of men will fill that gap, and therefore the female category must be for females only. The second fact I want to mention is about Caster Semenya. So as we know, Caster has the DSD 5 ARD. Semenya's personal best for 800 meters is 1:54.25, which puts Semenya 4th on the all-time list, on the women's all-time list. If you look at the men's all-time list on the World Athletics website, it stops at 1 minute 48.00 seconds. So it doesn't even go up to 1:54.25 and up to 1:48 for 800. more than 3,150 men ran faster. So you can see there again the enormous gulf between males and females, and this is only in a sport where it's only 10%. Going back to my elite career, I never, to my knowledge, had to compete against a male, but I competed many times against athletes who were doping. I suspected they were doping, and many of them were later found to be doping and served bans. Athletes don't like unfairness. When you're putting your life and soul into it, any amount of unfairness, as Sharron knows, is really intolerable for athletes. There were many indications that showed me that athletes were doping. For example, massive improvements with no apparent explanation. Athletes finishing the end of a race looking like they'd been, frankly, sitting on a sofa resting for 2 hours rather than running very hard. Strange patterns in the split times they ran in marathons, strange patterns in their competing before big competitions, and there are others. So elite athletes who are at the coalface every day training and competing, they know when something is not right. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that coaches and athletes in boxing have had suspicions about these two boxers who've been competing in Paris. Final couple of points. I just want to talk about money, because elite athletes earn a living through their sport for many of them. I earned a living as a runner for many years. This is about athletes' livelihoods, and what we've seen in the boxing ring is the female boxers are going to be earning less because of what's happened. By contrast, a website in Uzbekistan has reported that Lin, the Taiwanese boxer, will have earned $252,000 for silver, and that may be upgraded to a lifetime income from the Taiwanese government, this is, if Lin wins gold. I'm still owed several $1,000s from a race I did in 2010 when I was bumped up in the finishing order because of dopers. And being unable to earn a living was one of the major reasons why I retired, due to being robbed of finish places by dopers. And just to remind you that the advantage you get from doping is minuscule compared to the advantage that being male gives you. My final point is about IOC policy. So if you look at the IOC policy for the boxing, which they are running at Paris, there is nothing in there about sex. It's just about what's on your passport. So this means that even if Lin and Khalif's sex and condition were absolutely proved without any doubt, if documents about their condition were published, even then the IOC would allow them into the female category, because all they require is female on the passport, which is what these two athletes have. So the IOC really don't care if these athletes are male. They are welcome in the female category, which leads you to the next point, which is that, in fact, any male is welcome in the female category in boxing in Paris. So, if the IOC is still running boxing next time under the same rules, any man with a beard, any man, just plain old man, could self-ID and compete in the women's boxing. In theory, we've only had 2 male athletes this time around, but in theory, 100% of the participants in the women's boxing could be male, and under the IOC's policy, that would be fine. I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A, but I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Mara. So looking at the questions, there's a cluster of questions about the rules and the IOC and what information can be disclosed. I'll pick that up in a second. But there are a number of questions, I think, for Emma about the science. So has Sex Matters contacted the IBA directly for clarification? How does one know that these are not XY individuals with no benefit from the Y chromosome, complete insensitivity to testosterone? Could that be the case? And is it right that males with 5-ARD respond normally to testosterone? So Emma, if you would pick up those questions, please.
Yeah, so, okay, so as I mentioned when I was speaking earlier, these 2 sets of male DSDs, not half of them, but there's a group that are associated with male physiology, like 5-ARD. The other subset, which I didn't really expand on, includes probably two of the major names that will be out there are Swyer syndrome and complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, CAIS. And what's happening in these babies is that they've got some aspects of male development, but it doesn't complete. It's broken down actually quite significantly in this chain of events that I put together earlier. And these are babies who are really unambiguous at birth. When you look at their genitals, they look female. And because this chain of biological events that's needed to give male advantage is broken, they don't go through anything like male puberty. They don't acquire male athletic advantage, and they are, for the most part, allowed into female sports. As I perhaps kind of skipped over a little bit, sports selects for advantage, and given that these male DSDs don't confer any advantage, they're not the ones that are popping up in female sport. The ones that are popping through, and increasingly regularly now, are the ones that are masculinizing, the ones that have all these male physiology and the advantage that comes with that. So as I try to say, is it possible that they have this? Yes, we'd need to look more deeply at their DNA to find out. But is it likely, given that we know about what we know about female sport and how male DSDs are appearing, then I think it's a lot more likely that these boxers have a DSD that's associated with male development, male physiology, and male advantage. So that's something that would need to then become part of a medical kind of workflow, because this is now, we're talking about DSDs, they're medical conditions, and they have implications for health and that kind of thing. So I think at this point, this is where sports federations have to say, we're not handling this. These are now patients, really. In terms of the DSD that Caster Semenya has, and which I would speculate is the most likely candidate here, 5ARD. Yes, these are males who have a normal response to testosterone at puberty. In fact, the defect, the genetic defect, the mutation, is in a gene that, as far as we can tell, is only required for the penis to grow. Everything else about this body is male. And they have normal male testes, they have normal amounts of testosterone, and their body responds to that testosterone in a perfectly typical male way. And so that means they're acquiring male advantage, just like any other man. What's quite interesting, I think there was a little add-on about apart from their genital development, apart from external genital development. Actually, in the Dominican Republic, there's a cluster of this genetic disorder. And they refer to these boys who looked like girls when they were born. They refer to these boys as, I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, but guevedoches, which means eggs at 12, and by eggs they mean testicles. So this is a well-known process, and actually what we see with this disorder, 5ARD, is that when puberty kicks in and that huge amount of testosterone that males get actually starts to masculinize the external genitalia, so their external genitalia starts to catch up to male typical. So that's a kind of, there's lots of news reports about this cluster in the Dominican Republic. They've been studied quite heavily. And then the other question, I'm just looking at my post-it notes, something about the type of test. Oh yeah, so the type of test that I've gleaned from the IBA, I will admit I banged off an email to them and said, I don't want to know anything about, any private medical data. But can you describe the testing procedure? They didn't answer, but I have enough expertise to understand what I would have done and what I'm seeing out there, that this is what they've done. So what they've done is they've taken blood samples. From that, you would typically isolate white blood cells. So these are the cells that have DNA, and then red blood cells don't carry DNA around with them. They're too busy carting hemoglobin around. So you take white blood cells, you're going to literally smash them onto a microscope slide, put some stain on them, put a dye on them that lights up the chromosomes, and then you're going to look under a microscope and start counting. Okay, so this is very simple. This is the way you've been looking at chromosomes for 100 years, probably since chromosomes, and certainly since sex chromosomes were discovered. And this is the kind of test that is really the first type of screening that you would do with a cheek swab. Okay, you just look at the chromosomes. It's very routine. They haven't, as far as I can see, they haven't done anything remotely controversial. They haven't, you know, tried to take shortcuts or anything like that. So I think that was all the questions I jotted down. That
okay, fantastic. Let me pick up a few of the others then. So people are saying, what right do the opponents or the other Olympic, national Olympic committees, or indeed national governing bodies of boxing have to demand to know what's going on, to ask for information about these boxers? I don't know the answer to that. I do know that there have been, the reason this whole thing is happening is because some of their opponents, coaches and teams have been questioning and asking questions. And in part, that's because they've seen them at work. So for example, one national team, actually last year had Khalif come and train with them at a camp, a men's and women's boxing camp in Europe. And that Khalif was invited to spar with a woman in the same weight category, and that was stopped very quickly because the woman was getting hurt. Khalif was then invited to spar with another woman in that weight category. That was also stopped. And so then they realized that the only way to train together was to match Khalif with a man in the weight class below. And they said that worked fine. That was reported on a Spanish radio station called Radio Marco, and came from the National Commissioner of Boxing, the Boxing Commissioner for Spain. So that's out there in the public domain. So it's that kind of information that is the answer to the question people are still asking, which is, well, how do we know these aren't just people with XY chromosomes but no male advantage? As Emma's pointed out, it's highly unlikely that they would find their way to elite sport. And certainly there wouldn't be these questions being asked. It's because of the experience of people around them, like the example I've just given, that these questions are being asked. One more thing about the right to information. There may not be that right. Perhaps there should be an obligation to demonstrate eligibility. But one thing we do know is that if either of them had pursued an appeal to CAS, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, that would have led to their medical results being made public. You know, that's how we know about Caster Semenya and the other 800-meter runners. One of them didn't pursue at all. The other one initiated an appeal and then withdrew, let it lapse. So, you know, there are many ways that the information could be put out there legitimately, but those routes all rest with the IOC, the national, the National Olympic Committees of Algeria and Chinese Taipei, and of course the boxers and their teams. And we know that the IBA were warned off revealing any information by those National Olympic Committees. So everything points to, you know, they don't want the information out there. And yeah, so that's why we're having to speculate. But again, just to say, we would point back to the IOC and say, this isn't necessarily about individuals. This is about a complete failure of this organization to address the things they know need to be addressed, to provide a fair and safe category for female boxers. Okay, let's pick up some more questions. Let me just first pause and say, ask Sharron or Mara if they want to come in on anything.
Quite happy to answer questions if they come our way.
So here's an interesting one. You might have a view on this, Sharron. Is there any likelihood that the defeated females in these matches might take legal action against the IOC? And is there a route for CAS? We're not lawyers, but is there a route for CAS to accept such a legal challenge? Thoughts?
Good question. Yeah, as I said, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if there is that route, but, you know, you'd like to think that there ought to be from a duty of care perspective. And, you know, it is the job of any organisation, whether that is a school or a sports club or a governing body, or in fact, a world governing body like the IOC, to have a responsibility to safety. And at the moment, they are definitely negligent in this area when it comes to female athletes. They are not considering the damage, the potential damage of putting a male athlete in with a female athlete. So if I was one of those female athletes, I would be trying to pursue this for sure. The problem we've got is that these female athletes are very young. They are very intimidated. They are very silenced. And the IOC puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the governing bodies and the national associations to make their athletes sign documentation, which stops them, which takes away their voices. And that is also a problem that we have.
Yeah, yeah. Someone has commented, and maybe they didn't hear you earlier, Mara, but someone has commented that you have to be so exceptional as an athlete that they really think that for a man to beat the female world record at any distance, he needs to be a very good runner, better than 99% of all men. And to be an Olympian, you have to be way better. And that the populations, the male and female populations, substantially overlap. A lot of women are stronger, fitter, faster than the majority of men. Do we think that's true?
Well, there is overlap between the male and female populations. We know this. You know, if I went and had a race with any of my male neighbours, for example, I would probably beat them. This does not prove that females are faster than males. The opposite is true. And, you know, I gave you the stats earlier. In 2009, I was ranked second in the world in women's road running. 1,300 men ran faster than me. That is an enormous number. And that's because the gap between male and female performance is massive. 2:23.12, my personal best. If that were run by a man, that's the level of a good club runner. You know, you wouldn't qualify for any championship with that time, nowhere near. Whereas for me, running that time, I was ranked second in the world. So I would recommend a website called boysvwomen.com, which shows the gap between boys and adult females, elite female athletes. And one of the interesting facts that website shows is that the world records for females have all been broken by teenage boys. They vary in age according to the event, but teenage boys have broken all the female world records. And also, if you look at the qualifying times for the Olympics in athletics, in events where we can directly compare, so for example, the 100 meters, 5,000 meters, excluding things like steeplechase, where the hurdle heights are different, the qualifying standards for the males are all much, much faster than the women's world records. So this again gives you a feel for the enormous gulf between male and female performance.
Yeah, I think a very good example, Fiona, is Leah Thomas. You know, and I think that's one of the reasons why World Aquatics came in and did what they did, because they had this example. And my point has always been we shouldn't have to have a Leah Thomas in every sport before the governing bodies do the right thing, because all the science is there and the history of male and female performance is there. However, someone like Leah Thomas, who was an extremely average male athlete in distance freestyle, went from being in the 600s to beating 3 American silver medalists in the space of a year in a sprint event, which is like Mo Farah deciding he wants to win the 100 meters the following year. I mean, that's how utterly ridiculous it was. And this person was 6'4", you know, so for us, that was very useful because we had this obvious example that people could see. And as Mara's already pointed out, you know, in swimming, it's exactly the same. We have 14 and 15-year-old world records for boys that beat elite female athletes. And when we have our mixed medley relays, it's there for everyone to see in the swimming pool that if we have put a male backstroker up against a female backstroker leading off in our mixed medley relay, they hand over half the length of the pool ahead. That's 25 meters in front of the female competition. That's elite compared to elite. And when we have races that are being won by 200ths of a second, as with Adam Peaty and Matt Richards, and 500ths of a second by Ben Proud, you know, we're talking about the tiniest margins. So to give away 10% is insane, you know, and what is the point to WADA if we're going to do this? You know, WADA is there to try to stop people from gaining an unfair advantage. We should just do away with WADA altogether if we're going to say that males can compete in women's events.
Well, and everyone's, sorry, go Mara.
I just wanted to add to that in wrestling, the female competitor in the gold medal match was disqualified for being 100 grams over her weight category. You know, why on earth do we even have weight categories in sports like wrestling or boxing if males can go in the female category? It's complete nonsense. And also, an elite female, so an elite female at Olympic level, the equivalent male in performance terms is a relatively average male. And this is what we've seen by Leah Thomas and others. And I'm not a boxing expert, but I've watched a lot of the boxing this week, and I firmly believe that these two male boxers are frankly inferior as athletes compared to the females we've witnessed. And I've also watched some of the men's boxing, and it's absolutely clear that the two events, men's boxing, women's boxing, are very different events. So people may say, well, you know, these men don't always win. You know, as I said earlier, 1:54 for 800 meters by Semenya. This is a very average time for a male athlete. So yeah, what we're witnessing is not very good male athletes against the very best in the world female athletes.
Yeah. Someone has said, it's not clear to me what the IOC's ideology actually is. They haven't abolished the women's category altogether. Yes. Do they think it's only a small number of males in the female category is okay? I think that is what they think. I can only assume that's what they think, because of course they're not arguing to get rid of the female category altogether. And yet by implication, that is what will happen. And apropos of the conversation we've just had, I think people really fail to grasp, sometimes even people involved in sport, that it only takes a few not that talented males and they will make a big difference. They will bob up to the top, just like the example of the 800 meters runners. None of them would even be in their own national teams, and there they are winning Olympic medals. So I think that's part of the issue. Did you want to add something, Mara?
Yeah, Fiona, the IOC have in reality got rid of the female category. They're still calling it the female category, but it is now a mixed sex category.
Yeah. Now, someone is asking Emma, there are high-profile biologists who've bought into the gender identity ideology. How do they square that with their scientific training in regard to sports participation? Try and imagine you're in their heads.
Yeah, I've got the answer to that was the first one I picked up to write on a Post-it note. My Post-it note literally just says in scribbled capitals, I have no idea. I think there's probably a lot of cognitive dissonance going on, that people don't appreciate or value sport, that they don't fully understand, you know, the kind of huge amounts of academic understanding about the philosophy of sport and what categories are required for and that kind of thing. And so they may be scientific, and they may be, you know, have a vague uncomfortable feeling that okay, maybe there are only two sexes, but then the be kind of takes over, and then coupled with what you've just said about the IOC, let's be nice, and it's only a few, and that just really belies, I think, that they don't understand how that applies to sports. So yeah, I mean, no idea.
So one question here is, sometimes people will say, well, you guys always say that sex identified as at birth is all that matters, and now you're moving the goalposts. These are just women with a genetic variation that gives them an advantage. And then they bring up the Phelps thing, Michael Phelps with his big feet and big arms. Let me answer the first one, and then Emma can answer the second one, the Phelps gambit, which she's very familiar with. So most babies have their sex correctly identified at birth, but frankly, if there is an error, both the baby or the young person and anyone else around them deserves the truth. Because as Emma's pointed out, to have one of these disorders is a medical condition. It may come with other needs or other medical issues. And if a child is wrongly registered as female at birth when they in fact turn out to be male, that isn't moving the goalposts. That's just good medical practice to find that out. So I don't think that's any kind of a gotcha on trans people. Nobody can change sex, whether they're, and the piece of paper that they're, whether it's a passport or a certificate issued later in life, that doesn't reflect, you know, their body doesn't know that they've had a piece of paper. So those are two separate things. And when it comes to sport, it's the body that matters and not the piece of paper. Emma, but what about just genetic variation, genetic natural advantage like Michael Phelps? Hit it.
Yeah, so I have called this the Phelps gambit, and it's probably the longest running question that I get thrown at me all the time. So this is not just a genetic variation. Being male is not just a genetic variation. It's not like having like a gene that gives you big feet, you know, bigger feet than normal, or double joints or whatever, all of this kind of mythological stuff that we hear about Michael Phelps now. It is not just a genetic variation. It is a genetically driven difference that that we've created categories around, right? We haven't created categories for big feet or long arms or double jointedness. You could create a category for swimmers whose arms aren't as long as Michael Phelps, right? So his swimmers with short arms and swimmers with long arms. And if you want to argue for that, please be my guest. But what we're seeing, and going back to what Mara said about that wrestler, you can be sure that that boundary would be policed, right? Policed. And that if you have a short arm category of swimmers, you don't let the people with long arms into it. And so, like I say, it's the genetic variation that defines a category that we think is significant and important in sport. It is not the same as having long arms. And I would add that both, you know, my guess is I've stood next to Sharron, right? Her arms are going to be a lot longer than mine. Women can have long arms. They can have all of those genetic variations that Michael Phelps have. What women don't have is the genetic variation that made him male.
Emma, can I come in here as well? Because obviously I know Michael Phelps very well, and I know swimmers very well. And, you know, the Michael Phelps gambit is utterly ridiculous because everyone in the final with Michael had exactly the same benefits. You know, they were all very, very tall. They all had big hands and big feet. They all had long arms. You know, that is the shape of a swimmer, just the same as a gymnast is going to be the opposite. They're going to be very tiny. A volleyball player is going to be tall. A basketball player is going to be tall. You know, when we get to the Olympic Games, all of the people that are in elite sport are going to be benefiting from a body type because it's basically physics and biology coming together. You know, what's ridiculous is not a single world record of Michael Phelps still stands. And we've just had Leon Marchand, you know, in the swimming pool win 4 gold medals. Leon is about 3 inches shorter, you know, and yet he still managed to beat Michael Phelps's world records. The East German that beat me 44 years ago, her German record still stands 44 years later because of the testosterone that she was given, you know, so, and she wasn't even as fast as the men in those races in those days. You know, this is what's utterly ridiculous. There is no gotcha with this whatsoever. This is just the shape of a swimmer or the shape of a gymnast or the shape of a body, you know, a volleyball player. Michael is no different than the people that he was competing against at that level.
No,
and we can actually look at that another way, which is that if you take the Americans, Ryan Lochte and Missy Franklin, who were the Olympic champions couple of Olympics back in the same events, men's and women's,
200
they're the same size. They're both 6'2". They're the same size. They competed in the same event. They both were the best in their category, but he was typically 10% faster.
Yeah, he was 11%.
Not because he was 10% bigger. It's because he was 100% male.
Yeah.
And he was 100% female. I shouldn't use percentages. I don't mean there's anything in between. I mean, it's a simple classification, and you can have all the variation you like within that category. It will not compensate for that fundamental. I've got a couple of questions. Maybe Mara and Sharron would like to pick these up about the protests. So people think that Carini might have been put under pressure to apologize. Might they have been threatened with sanctions? What do we think about women making X symbols and women here speaking out? And does that raise public consciousness?
I think what's really fascinating is if there, as we've seen throughout history, when a new swimsuit comes along, when a para-athlete with a blade wants to race, you know, male athletes, whenever there is a threat to male sport, it is squashed immediately. Men will not put up with unfair sport. Women, unfortunately, are not given the same luxury, and they're not given the same voice. And I do think it's important that women start trying to come together. You know, we've had successful pushbacks in, say, track in this country, for example, because the women got together behind the scenes. But I do think the women need to be more vocal. They need to say, we are not happy with this situation. But as I have already explained, it is very difficult because they are made to sign very restricted contracts, and a lot of them will have sponsor contracts as well, and that also stops them from being able to use their voices. So they're threatened with loss of income. And when these athletes are really only just earning enough money to pay their way, that's a very difficult thing to turn around and say you're going to remove the only, you know, the way that they have to pay their bills and to remain in their sport. So it is very hard. That is why it is the job of the journalists to you know, really open all of this up and to not enable any subterfuge to be going on and misinformation to be put out there.
If I can answer that as well, I absolutely applaud the female athletes who've been protesting, making X signs. They're brave, they're principled. I absolutely support them. What I would say more generally is more people need to speak up on this. Sharron has been in the lead for many, many years, and other athletes have joined. More athletes need to speak up on this, female and male athletes, especially the retired athletes. You know, we all know that some of us get abuse and loss of income for doing so, but what are we going to do? Are we going to just stay silent and let women's sport burn? You know, and now the world is waking up because of this. We've had very senior politicians, the Italian Prime Minister, the President of Bulgaria, you know, other very senior people, Sebco. This has really woken the world up. So this is a golden opportunity for any female athletes or indeed others who are still sitting on the fence and worried. Now is your time to start speaking up before more damage is done.
And I think it's important to understand that this isn't just a female problem. You know, these are male athletes that are infringing on female sport. So this isn't a woman's problem. This isn't everyone's problem, because we all have sisters and teammates, you know, that are female. So this is about just standing up for what is right, and then getting the debate open and transparent and respectful so we can find solutions for the problem. You know, Mara mentioned that I've been, you know, speaking out for a long time. I have been. For the first 4 years, I wasn't even allowed to debate. I wasn't allowed to present the science. I wasn't allowed to speak the truth, you know, because the whole issue was being deliberately squashed with no debate. Because the moment we could present the science, we could prove that this was not the right thing to do, and that we were asking women to compete in an unfair, biased environment. And now we are seeing the results of that. You know, my point was always I wanted to stop the least number of females losing out possible. And the worst scenario, I wanted to stop a female from getting either seriously injured or killed, to prove the absolute obvious.
And we still hope it won't come to that. We're getting to the end. We can run over a bit if people want to stay, but I want to make sure we've picked up all the main questions. So there's a question here about essentially about the IOC throwing shade on the IBA. That the IBA tested 4 athletes, and then the 2 that we're talking about are the ones who tested ineligible. Do we know the nationalities of the other 2? And is that anything to do with this question of the Russian having fought a Russian? Do we know anything about that? Anyone?
I mean, I don't think there's anything to do with Russians. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, this was a straightforward sex screening test that went to a laboratory and came back, you know, showing that these 2 individuals were not eligible to compete in the female criteria based on IBA's policy, which was no males in this category. It's as simple as that. You know, and it really doesn't take an Einstein to work out what must have been on those bits of paper. And these 2 athletes could have cleaned this up instantly, but by declaring their results, by showing us their results. They have deliberately gone out of their way, as has the IOC, to make sure that those results cannot be exposed. That tells us everything we need to know.
Yeah, in fact, the IOC have been in this bizarre position of simultaneously insisting that these 2 are women, but also saying no one really knows what a woman is or how to prove it, which is the kind of tangle you end up in when you sign up for this belief system. You know, someone asked about the scientists, and Emma here, who follows the evidence, is utterly perplexed because these are people who are choosing to ignore the evidence and to avoid the evidence. And they seem, some of them, grossly offended by the fact that any evidence exists. And yet, why and how could we have a female category in sport if we didn't use some kind of criterion on which to say some of us qualify for that and some of us don't? I've got one more question, which is another theme we've not picked up. People may need to go, but we'll carry on for a little bit. How can we hold journalists to account on this issue is the question. Sharron, do you want to lead?
Oh my, I honestly don't know. Honestly, I did a BBC News piece the other night, and I was pulling my hair out, because every question that came at me was wrong. And it was as if this person had done absolutely no research whatsoever. And I find it astonishing. You know, you only have to go onto Google to find out what DSD 46XY5ARD is. And those documents are in the CAS report and the CAS ruling. So there is no ambiguity with this. There's no grey area with this. This is exactly who Caster Semenya is. And yet they still presented it to me as if I was talking about a biological female. And I seriously, when I went up against the wall and bashed my head against it, because I don't understand. I don't understand why our news outlets are doing this. And sad to say, particularly the BBC.
I want to come back to those 3 myths then, that misinformation, which has been out there in the media and still is quite a lot. And just reiterate, is sex a spectrum? No, it is not. Are there people who are neither male nor female? No, there are not. There are vanishingly rare cases of mixed reproductive material in some people. Those people are not in the Olympics. Are these individuals born a girl, born female? We don't know, but we know that Caster Semenya, who took his case to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, was not born a girl. He was erroneously identified as being a girl, registered as such, but his medical condition later revealed that he was indeed a male with internal testes and the ability to respond to that. So hence, a very average 800-meter male runner running 1:54 can get an Olympic medal because he's faster than all the women. So sex is not a spectrum. These individuals, we don't know about the boxers, but if it's anything, if it is this 5ARD condition, they're not born a girl or born female. They're wrongly identified as such. Is Caster Semenya a woman with high testosterone? No. He's a man with normal testosterone. That may well be the case here. We don't know. As Sharon's just said, it is in the power of many different people to dispel this misunderstanding if these boxers are indeed female, or if they are people with XY chromosomes and no ability to process or produce testosterone so that they do not bring male advantage to the female category. I think if that were the case, we wouldn't be here talking about them. You know, I think we've all watched a lot more Olympic boxing. I can't speak for some of the boxing correspondents on here, but speaking for myself, I've watched a lot more Olympic boxing than I ever expected to. And I can tell you there's a reason for that. And it's because there is so much noise around people who other female boxers are calling out and saying, this is not right, this is not normal. And we saw it first with Angela Carini, this is not just, this is not fair. So
I think the other thing to mention, Fiona, is I've just literally come back from Paris, you know, and as you know, I'm contacted, you know, literally weekly, if not daily, by either parents of very distressed young sportswomen, or by sportswomen themselves, or by coaches. And I've had a number of people reach out to me this week that are in other fighting sports to say this is not the only fighting sport. This is not the only sport. These are the ones we know about, right? That's also worth mentioning.
yes.
If I can add also, you know, it is extremely unlikely, but if this turns out to be one big Russia-related hoax and the IBA falsified the tests and it was all just made up, nevertheless, the IOC policy allows any male with a female passport into the boxing. None of this changes the policy.
Yeah.
Yes, and none of this has to be happening at all, because if these were very strong women, it would be very easy for any of the people in this chain to dispel the misinformation. That's right. They could do a cheek swab. Emma could analyze it in 3 hours and give the result. And you're right. The IOC philosophy is we're not doing that because it says female in their passport. That is enough.
Yeah.
And so, you know, people are worried about doping by swimmers, and there have been questions asked about the Chinese swimmers. Well, hey, turns out all they need to do is get a man. It doesn't even have to be a talented swimmer, just a half decent swimmer, change his passport to say female, and the IOC will accept that. Of course, he won't be able to do that in swimming because World Aquatics doesn't accept it. They've actually got sex screening with a cheek swab written into their rules. So somehow they seem fairly confident they can tell who's women and who's not.
And I think we have to understand that more and more countries are allowing people to change their documentation easier and easier and easier and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You know, and if you can turn around to somebody and say you can make £250,000 or you can have a salary for the rest of your life just by taking this piece of paper to the IOC, there will be individuals that will do that. You know, that's why we have WADA. That's why we have cheating in sport. You know,
in this country, you don't even need a legal change of sex to change your passport. It's enough to get a letter from your GP and write to the passport office, and they will change your passport marker. So it's very simple. And we're not suggesting people are doing it intentionally. Who knows? But the fact is, it's It's women who pay the price when the wrong people are in the category. Any final remarks that people want to make? Emma, let's go round. Yeah, so we'll go Mara, Emma, Sharron.
So we've heard a lot of people say the female boxers must boycott, or female athletes generally, when they come up against males, must boycott. I reject this for two main reasons. One is many female athletes will not know that they're competing against males. Obviously, in boxing, it's quite obvious, but in my sport, in distance running, most races have many thousands of athletes in them, and it's often a mixed start, so men and women run together. You have absolutely no way of knowing if there are males in the female category. And the second reason is, this is not the responsibility of young athletes who are devoting their lives to training and competition. Providing fair competition, clear rules, which everybody adheres to, is the job of sports administrators, officials, governing bodies. This should not fall on athletes. I felt the same about doping when I was competing. I felt so angry about being robbed of prize money, better finish positions, fairness, etc. And I just constantly ask myself, why on earth are these administrators, regulators, governing bodies not doing their jobs? It shouldn't fall to athletes to have to protest, complain, boycott. And if you're talking about boycotting at the Olympics is the pinnacle of a sport career for many athletes. You work your behind off for years, decades sometimes. You finally manage to qualify and get selected for the Olympics. Are you going to throw all that away just because the officials have failed to uphold fairness? No, you're not. This is your dream.
Yes. Sharron?
There is there's a very, very simple solution to this. We have a protected female classification. We have an open and inclusive classification. That's the only solution to this problem. You cannot bring in third categories, or, you know, we've seen that with marathons where they've had binary categories. It means nothing. All that happens is that not very good males win the binary categories, you know, the non-binary categories. Yeah. It's just ridiculous. So the solution to this problem is a protected female sex screened classification and an open, fully inclusive classification. So everybody is welcome in sport. However, the end result will be that we still get the best female and the best male, because they'll be the ones that will win.
Yeah. Emma, any last comments?
Yeah, just to say that I think moving forward, we are going to probably see sports federations weighing up sex screening as a matter of routine when athletes, perhaps when athletes first apply, you know, they first turn up for their first affiliated competition, they first register with the sports federation, so they're probably quite young, they're out of the public eye, they're not in the spotlight. Let's do it early, do it once in a lifetime, and make sure that we get it right for the female category.
Yeah. So final comments then. On our website, sex-matters.org, under the sport tab, there are some resources on this. There's a summary of the DSDs that are relevant in sport. There's an overview about male-female differences in sport. Not that you need to be told, but it seems some people do. We have also got a media guide, which is rather different from the IOC media guide, because as you can tell, the only way to have a coherent conversation about sport, and especially about women's sport, is if you can talk about who's male and who's female. That is one thing that journalists could do to help, is actually let's start telling people about these issues in a really straightforward way, rather than dancing around with females with high testosterone. It's no wonder the public are confused. I believe we've done a recording of this, so we'll make that available too. And of course, you know how to find us if you have more questions. Thank you very much for joining. And well, let's see if we can make a difference. Thanks.